Well, as we saw in that report, COVID-19 is spreading in a number of countries in Latin America, including in Venezuela, where only 10 deaths have been reported and where there are fewer than 1,000 known cases. But the true scale of the outbreak is thought to be much worse, with many cases going unaccounted. But also of concern is the safety of the millions of refugees and migrants from Venezuela who fled their country and who are now living a precarious existence in other parts of the continent. Well, for more, we can speak now to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, who joins us from Geneva. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us. Before we speak specifically about Venezuela and its people, just tell us, if you will, what you think the scale of the problem in Latin America is right now with regard to COVID-19.
You just mentioned the very grim trends that have been observed in the last couple of weeks. There is a significant escalation of contagion throughout the continent, and health structures are not always able to respond, and the economic impact is already very significant because of lockdowns.
Yes, indeed. And I mean, being a refugee in Latin America in the midst of a pandemic is a terrifying situation for the Venezuelan refugees who are living in various different parts of the continent, far from home.
Indeed, and we should not forget, we're talking about 5 million people. This is a very significant population throughout the continent. But the most affected countries are Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, Brazil itself, so some of those that you mentioned in your report. And you have a double effect. You have a health impact. Venezuelans are exposed like everybody else. This virus doesn't make distinctions in that respect. But you have an economic effect, which is also devastating, because 80% of those 5 million depend on daily wages, the informal economy, which is absolutely impacted by lockdowns. So they lose livelihoods and they precipitate in situations of poverty.
So tell us, what is being done to help them, and what sort of sums of money are needed, and specifically with regard to what the UNHCR is doing, if you will?
I would say that the most important is to continue to advocate with host governments that have been exceptionally hospitable to include Venezuelans in their health responses. And then, of course, we need to make sure, and this is more difficult, that they're also included in social safety nets, social protection nets that are being put in place by governments. On the humanitarian front, we estimate that we need about $1.5 billion to help Venezuelans throughout this year. And we've got very little of that money, about 4 or 5%. But then we also need money from big financial institutions to help countries impacted and to ensure that whatever they do with those funds includes Venezuelans, refugees and migrants. This is the big challenge ahead of us.
And donor conferences and the like are in the pipeline.
There's a donor conference, virtual, of course, foreseen for next Tuesday. Spain and the European Union and other governments are leading it. The UN, especially UNHCR and IOM, were leading the response to this crisis, will also be part of this conference. And we hope that the humanitarian appeal will be well responded to, but also that bilateral contributions from especially financial institutions, big bilateral aid bodies, we hope that there will be also substantive bilateral help to countries in the region to help them beef up their health systems, their social protection systems, which are additionally impacted by COVID and by the presence of Venezuelans.
So you are therefore optimistic that the target that you mentioned, the sum of money that's required, will indeed be an achievable target, given that there are donors out there and there's this conference planned for Tuesday?
It's a difficult time for foreign aid, for humanitarian aid, for development aid, because even in donor countries, governments are confronted with an escalation of what they have to spend to respond to the crisis. So it's difficult, but we've been working very hard together with Spain and the EU for the past few months, and I think we'll get a good response. I hope that it will be as close as possible to our targets.
Okay, and just broadening the discussion out a little bit. I mean, Venezuela is a country of 28 million people or so. It is a bit of a case study, isn't it, for the impact that a refugee crisis can have on a continent. I'm just wondering whether you can see parallels being drawn, perhaps here in Europe, with refugees trying to enter Europe and Europe having to suddenly respond to an emergency if indeed people from other parts of the world suddenly decide that now more than ever is the time to be coming to Europe to escape from very few opportunities elsewhere, given the seriousness of the pandemic.
And you're absolutely right. You know how difficult it has been in recent years to convince states to accept asylum seekers, particularly, I would say, when they're fleeing from war, persecution, collapse of institutions, political crisis such as Venezuela. Those people are seeking safety for the sake of their own lives. So they meet now additional obstacles, legitimate ones, I would say, because states have the duty in a way to protect their populations by imposing restrictions to movements. But those movements are the lifeline of these people. So you see the very terrible dilemmas that we're facing at the moment. What we're saying to governments all over the world, we're saying we understand that you have to impose restrictions, limitations. Let them be as humane and as temporary as possible. And when the pandemic is over, when it starts de-escalating, let's resume the discussion on what needs to be done to receive and to address the issue of asylum seekers.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for speaking to us, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, in Geneva. Thank you so much indeed.